This is the first of two videos where I'm going to be talking about some more unusual members of the flute family. As you can see, sitting next to me, I have a collection of modern Böhm system flutes. And we're going to be talking about these two right here in the middle over the next two videos. Fair warning though, please remember I am a composer first and foremost, bassoonist by training. Flute is my absolute worst woodwind, so when I play and do demonstrations, please do not hold that against me or the instrument. But I will play a little bit to give you some kind of idea of the characteristics that these instruments produce. Obviously, in my hand right here is a standard C flute. This happens to be just a standard cheap student model, closed hole, low C foot. But the instrument we're going to be talking about today is a little bit smaller. It is the E-flat flute, sometimes called a soprano flute or a third flute or a terz flute because it's pitched a third higher. Now, this instrument is not seen much today. In fact, there's really only one maker out there who's still making these instruments, and they're special order, and you just don't see them a lot. This particular instrument that I have is on loan to me, and we'll just go ahead and say that this instrument, this video is sponsored by the guy loaning it to me. It's David Schottel at David's Instrument Repair in Carrollton, Texas, and he's kindly allowed me to borrow both this instrument and the instrument we'll talk about in the next video for a couple weeks so that I can try them out just a little bit, get my fingers around them, get my ear adjusted to the sound of, well, these midway flutes. Now, this particular instrument here is a Gemeinhardt, made in Elkhart, Indiana. And I didn't even know that Gemeinhardt made E-flat flutes. There were a few American makers. C.G. Kahn made them, Armstrong made them, Emerson made them, Artley may have made them, and of course we have our Gemeinhardt here. This is probably nickel silver plated. It's not a fancy instrument. In fact, none of the instruments made really were on professional level instruments. So why a flute in E-flat? Well, we've got our standard C flute here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a C scale in half notes 2.5 octaves because I can't play really much above there. And I'm going to first give you an idea of the sound. So first, the C flute. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing on the E-flat flute. This will sound a minor third higher. And so you can hear that everything is just a little bit smaller, a little bit more compact on this instrument. So let's talk a little bit of history. The E-flat flute at one point was actually known as the F flute because, of course, the old fingering conundrum we have pre-Böhm system instruments were named for their 6-finger note, and Böhm instruments are named for their 7-finger note. So the 6-finger note here is a F, and then the 7-finger note is a E-flat. So, E-flat flute. Where do we find this instrument? Well, it was used primarily by military bands. And one of the earliest examples we know of it is Berlioz's Grande Symphonie Funèbre et Triomphale, the Grand Funeral and Triumphal Symphony. Here he called for 5 E-flat flutes, and to pair with that, of course, 4 D-flat piccolos. So pairing of E-flats and D-flats together. A very interesting combination. No C instruments at all. And the part really reflects that. I would attempt to play the part, but I can't. It is actually beyond my range of being able to play there. I mean, the first note is opening high G, sounding a B flat. And most editions, most scores of this piece actually just show it as a C flute. That particular note would have been right at the very top of the C flute's range at the time. But Berlioz, of course, goes higher than that. And so, at the time, the part could not have been played on the C flute. It had to have been done on the E flat. I've also been able to uncover another instance of its use in military bands by Edvard Grieg, of all people, who wrote one band piece, the Sørges March over Rikard Nordraak. And again, Norwegian friends, forgive me if I mispronounced that, because I really felt like I sounded like the Swedish chef there. But during the 20th century, there was a move, particularly in American band circles, to have the E-flat flute replace the E-flat clarinet in the wind bands. And just said, oh yeah, just take your E-flat clarinet part, play it on an E-flat flute. Problem solved if you don't have an E-flat clarinet player, because you always have more extra flute players, right? Turns out that didn't really work very well, and it didn't really catch on. Despite being advertised in magazines all over, it just was never a popular idea. The E-flat clarinet still held on because it needed to fulfill its role, and this instrument just could not take over. And it could be that because this instrument couldn't fill in the role of the E-flat clarinet, that it died away and really wasn't used. Of major wind band works in the 20th century, I've only been able to uncover a handful of pieces that use it, including Penderecki's Pittsburgh Overture, and I believe Husa's Saxophone Concerto. They both have parts for it, but those parts are generally going to be played nowadays on the C flute or possibly the piccolo, just depending on the tessitura involved. Of course, I have written for it once in Symphony Number 3, my most recently completed symphony, and it's the part for it is doubled, so the player will play C flute and E flat flute, and just go back and forth, just depending on the kind of sound wanted. The sound of the E flat flute is a little bit smaller. It's I like to call it kind of crystalline, a little bit brittle. I'm going to attempt to play one of the solos from my Symphony 3 on the E-flat flute. Note, I say attempt, because, again, I am a terrible flute player. But this may give you some idea, mid to upper range. It gives you some idea, and again, forgive my atrocious flute playing there. So let's talk a little bit about the specs here on this particular instrument. It is almost identical in setup to my C flute. It has the closed tone holes, it has the offset G, and it goes down to low C. One interesting feature of the E-flat flute is that the foot joint, well, there isn't a foot joint. It only comes apart into two pieces, the head joint and the body. The foot joint is attached. I'm not sure why this particular design is pretty prevalent in E-flat flutes, but it's fairly common among the instruments that are extant. That said, it is not uncomfortable to play where the foot joint or foot keys are located. It's not really a foot joint. But as far as using the instrument, these instruments can be found every now and then. Mostly flute players will have them kind of in their collection. They're not something that they bring out very often. And a lot of times players will comment that they don't play as well in tune as will their C flute. And part of that is most of these are student level instruments, whereas they're probably going to be playing on a professional level C flute. And I've noticed some intonation issues on this particular instrument, particularly if I play open C sharp. And it very well could be that the head cork here is just in the wrong position. Because this instrument does not come with a tuning rod, I can't verify that for sure. And a tuning rod for the E-flat flute will, of course, be different than for the C flute because different length head joints. It does fill in a very interesting role, though, in between the C flute and the piccolo. To give you an idea, here's a little bit of sound on the piccolo. And again, forgive me, my piccolo playing is even worse than my flute playing. And you can hear that there really is a vast tonal difference. And the piccolo feels breathy, haunting almost down there, whereas this feels much more just like a regular flute, just shrunk just a little bit. But the E-flat flute, it's an interesting instrument. The inventor of the modern flute system, Theobald Barum, really thought that a quartet of, say, piccolo, E-flat flute, C flute, I have that backwards, don't I? Piccolo, E-flat flute, C flute, and then alto flute, which I don't have, would be a perfect flute quartet. And you've got a varied spectrum of instruments, and it fills in a lot of gaps. In the orchestra, I really do not know any pieces no, I do not know any pieces off the top of my head that call for the E-flat flute. Pretty much this instrument has only stayed in band music, and even then, in the very fringes of band music. So, let me know, what do you think about the E-flat flute? Have you used it? Have you played one? Would you write for it if one were available? Of course, like, comment, and subscribe down below. And to give you a little bit more sample on here, I'm going to play just the beginning of Debussy's Syrinx on the E-flat flute. And again, forgive my atrocious playing.